Bay of Biscay, the 27th of March, 1944, 0600 hours. Lieutenant Wilhelm Steinberg watched from the bridge of U-960 as his Type Vici slipped through the pre-dawn gloom toward La Pallas. Two concrete-reinforced barrier vessels rode on either side of his boat, while four M-class minesweepers kept station as a protective screen, their banks of 20mm and 37mm flak bristling in the weak light, ready to unleash a wall of fire at any Allied aircraft that dared to attack. Unbeknownst to him, 6 British Mosquitoes and 2 specially modified variants were already closing from 5,000 feet, each carrying a 57mm Molins gun loaded with armor-piercing rounds intended to strike from beyond the effective range of German anti-aircraft defenses. The convoy had steamed through the night with the assurance of Admiral Karl Donnetz's new defensive doctrine, which paired submarines with heavily armed escorts to create overlapping fields of AA fire. A response to the brutal losses of 1943, when lone U-boats were frequently caught on the surface by Allied aircraft. What Steinberg and his peers did not know was that the British had developed a counter to that very tactic, mounting a modified 57mm anti-tank cannon in the nose of their fastest twin-engine fighter, effectively turning it into airborne artillery capable of engaging targets out to about 1,800 yards, well beyond the accurate reach of German 20mm flak, which became ineffective past roughly 2,000 meters and far outside the practical engagement envelope of 37mm guns. Against swift aircraft, work on the weapon began in 1943 after the Air Ministry observed U-boats increasingly fighting back on the surface rather than diving. Some boats, such as U-440 Orne, had been converted into heavily armed U-flak platforms with 2 quadruple 20mm mounts and a 37mm gun, creating floating AA batteries that could throw up such a withering barrage that attackers were forced to close to roughly 500 meters to drop depth charges or fire rockets, a range at which even robust coastal command aircraft were vulnerable to concentrated automatic fire. The solution came from an unexpected source, the Molins Company of Peterborough, whose experience building cigarette-making machines had produced advanced automatic feed systems. Desmond Molins and his engineers adapted that technology to autoload the British Army's QF 6-pounder anti-tank gun, turning a manually loaded piece into a semi-automatic cannon capable of about 55 rounds per minute, although aircraft installations carried only around 25 rounds because of weight limits. When de Havilland engineers at Hatfield examined mounting the weapon in a Mosquito, they faced the problem of accommodating a gun that weighed roughly 1,580 pounds fully loaded, its barrel projecting ahead of the nose, necessitating the removal of the usual Hispano cannons and leaving only 2.303 Browning machine guns for aiming, yet tests proved the trade-off worthwhile. The 57mm round could penetrate a submarine's pressure hull after passing through 2 feet of water at approximately 400 meters, well beyond the distance at which German gunners could reliably engage a fast-moving aircraft. In June 1943, the first Mosquito FBMKV converted from airframe, HJ732, underwent live-fire trials at the de Havilland Works, and test pilot Pat Fillingham reported the aircraft kicked violently when the cannon was fired. The recoil sheared rivets in the forward fuselage until engineers fitted reinforcing struts and a large hydraulic buffer beneath the gun, producing a noticeable bulge on the aircraft's belly. Engineers also added roughly 900 pounds of armor plating around the engines and under the cockpit floor to shield the crew from return fire by the heavily armed submarines that had become the principal targets. Squadron leader Tony Phillips of 248 Squadron had been operating Mosquitoes over the Bay of Biscay since December 1943 after converting from both, precisely as German U-boats began transiting in convoy with surface escorts, a shift that made conventional low-level depth charge attacks almost suicidal. The introduction of the first Tsetse variants in March 1944 offered a different tactic, letting Phillips' crews engage from standoff ranges where German 20mm flak gunners found it difficult to track the quick-moving Mosquitoes, their rounds falling short or wide while the attackers held their distance. German anti-aircraft doctrine had been shaped by Mediterranean experience, where Hallmann Friedrich Christensen, commanding a flak battery in occupied France, trained crews to engage low-flying aircraft inside roughly 1,000 meters, the zone in which the 20mm Flak 38 could reliably strike a 300 miles per hour target. Those calculations changed dramatically when targets remained at 1,500 meters or more, forcing gunners to lead by such extreme angles that small errors in estimation produced complete misses. The Regia Marina learned similar lessons during convoy battles off Sicily. Capitano di Corvetta, Giuseppe Fontana, commanding the escort Orsa, found his ship sprayed a 20mm mounts could create an impressive curtain of fire, but seldom scored hits on British Beaufort torpedo bombers that released ordnance from beyond 1,000 meters. prompting Italian naval commanders to request German 37mm guns that could reach out to about 4,800 meters, though even those weapons struggled with the deflection shooting required against obliquely approaching aircraft. Corvette Caping, Hans Rudolf Rosing, commanding the 2nd U-boat flotilla, watched Allied anti-submarine tactics evolve with mounting concern, noting in his war diary that British aircraft seemed uncannily adept at locating U-boats even when heavily escorted, unaware that ultra-intercepts were furnishing Coastal Command with precise routing information. More troubling was the account from U-960's previous patrol, in which Aberlieutenant Zauer C. Gunther Heinrich observed British aircraft keeping their distance and apparently conducting reconnaissance without ever closing to attack. The Japanese would face a similar threat on the 10th of May 1944, when I-29, carrying vital technical cargo from Germany, including Walter rocket engines and Enigma material, steamed under the protection of German destroyers Z-23 and ZH-1 and escorting Junkers Ru-88 fighters. Commander Takazu Kanashi, watching through his periscope, had no inkling of the weapon that would soon threaten his escorts as British Mosquitoes. We approached. Without warning, the Mosquitoes opened fire from what seemed an impossible range. 57mm impact slammed into the destroyer's plating, spraying fragments across the sea, and a single round from squadron leader Phillips' gun ripped away the port engine of one Ru-88. On U-960's bridge that March morning, Steinberg ordered his lookouts to stay sharp. As the convoy neared the swept channel into La Pallas, the 4 M-class minesweepers holding position about 500 meters out, while 2 concrete-reinforced barrier vessels led the column through waters Britain had been mining for months. The escort's 20mm and 37mm batteries were manned and topped up with belts of mixed high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds, theoretically able to reach aircraft at up to 4,000 meters. Though everyone accepted that useful accuracy fell away sharply beyond roughly 2,000 meters. German naval anti-aircraft practice had developed early in the war. Commanders assumed a U-boat could simply dive when aircraft appeared, a tactic that worked in 1940-41 while Coastal Command was short of aircraft and detection. Gear was poor. The introduction of centimetric radar, which German receivers could not detect, together with Lee lights that picked out subs at night, swung the initiative to the hunters and increasingly forced U-boats to remain surfaced and fight. The U-Flak conversions were Admiral Dinitz's attempt to counter that. Threat boats such as U-441, U-256, U-621, and U-953 were refitted as floating anti-aircraft batteries with quadruple 20mm mounts and beefed-up 37mm guns. Their torpedo loads reduced to 5 to make room for extra crew. The experiment proved disappointing. The U-Flak boats could claim only a couple of confirmed shoot-downs while suffering heavy losses when Allied aircraft adopted new tactics of standoff circling and calling in reinforcements to overwhelm the defensive barrage. Lieutenant Wolfgang Muller, gunnery officer, aboard U-256 during its conversion, wrote home about the fearsome effect of a 4-barrel 20mm mount up to 800 rounds per minute when all barrels fired, a stream of tracers that looked like a rope of fire. But he also warned that each gun held only 20 rounds, forcing frequent reloads that opened dangerous gaps in the curtain of fire which skilled Allied pilots learned to exploit. Britain's countermeasures advanced on several fronts. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment developed radar capable of spotting periscopes at about 5 miles, and weapons teams at the Royal Aircraft Establishment trialed highball and guided concepts. Yet the pragmatic solution proved to be a large CALIBRE gun, once the Molins company showed its autoloader could reliably feed heavy 57mm shells. Wing Commander Peter Wim Barnes, Deputy Director of Operational Requirements at the Air Ministry, pushed the Mosquito project through skepticism from officers who favored rockets, arguing in a June 1943 memorandum that the 57mm offered much better long accuracy. Trials reportedly produced a roughly 33% hit rate on tank-sized targets versus about 5% for acknowledging rockets were easier to fit across many fighter-bomber types. Converting Molins cigarette machinery workshops to build autoloaders required major retooling. Machinists, accustomed to tobacco packaging, began making 5-tray feed systems, reinforced with heavy-gauge steel and driven by hydraulic rams to cycle 2-pound brass cartridges and 6-pound shells reliably under combat. German intelligence intercepted fragmentary rumors. Agents in Portugal and airmen forced down in neutral countries told stories of a flying 6-pounder that could sink a submarine with a single hit, but Naval High Command mostly shrugged these off as propaganda, convinced the recoil would wreck any wooden aircraft. They did not know that de Havilland engineers had tamed the recoil with hydraulic buffers and structural reinforcements, and on the morning of the 27th of March, conditions were ideal for an anti-shipping strike. A cloud base near 3,000 feet concealed the Mosquitoes until gaps in the overcast let them pick up the convoy. With squadron leader Phillips leading the attack in Mosquito NT-225, Thompson, the navigator, cross-checked their position against the plotted track of U-960 supplied by intelligence, unaware that the fix itself had been derived from ultra-decrypts revealing the submarine's exact course and timing. In the operations room at 19 Group Headquarters in Plymouth, Air Vice Marshal Brian Baker tracked the strike via position reports over the radio, aware this mission would be the real test of whether the Mosquito Molins concept could stand up to a heavily defended convoy. Hits on individual U-boats had taught little about performance under concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple escorts, especially the purpose-built Flak merchants. Those converted merchantmen posed a special problem. Up to 8 20mm mounts and heavier 47mm pieces bolted to their decks and sheathed in concrete armor, commanded by seasoned Kriegsmarine officers who knew how to coordinate their batteries with other escorts to weave overlapping belts of flak covering any approach. Their gun crews were drilled to keep up steady fire under pressure, unlike merchant sailors who might break when aircraft dove. Captain Xerxes Robert Chizzy, who had led these barrier ships since 1942, had written the tactics, position for maximum anti-aircraft, coverage of U-boat columns, and open up on any aircraft inside 4,000 meters. Hostile intent or not, arguing that over the Bay of Biscay, every British plane should be treated as a threat. That hardline approach produced occasional friendly fire incidents, but the unforgiving maths of AA shooting left no room for error. Crews had to estimate target speed and heading, calculate shell, time of flight, and aim it where the aircraft would be, all while their own ship pitched and rolled. The difficulty rose dramatically with distance, a hit probability that might be around 10%. At 1,000 meters fell too well under 1%. At 3,000 meters, even with advanced range-finding gear, Sergeant Giovanni Martinelli, an Italian gunner pressed into German service after Italy's surrender and manning a 37mm. On one of the barrier ships, later recalled the frustration of watching British aircraft loiter just beyond effective range as crews expended thousands of rounds in fruitless exchanges that drained ammunition and wore down gun crews without decisive results. Rear Admiral Kojima Hideo, the Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, noted in reports to Tokyo that German weapons, particularly the 37mm Flak 36, with its high cyclic rate and practical ceiling near 4,200 meters were excellent, but that the human factor lagged. Gunners needed months of training to develop the instinctive lead required for effective shooting. Training made scarce as experienced instructors were pulled into frontline units to replace casualties. On U-960's bridge, Steinberg swept the horizon with his binoculars as the convoy closed on the final approach to La Pallas. The familiar bulk of the concrete U-boat pens rose ahead, their roofs bristling with AA positions that could join the defense. Still, he felt unease, perhaps the other boats' reports of British aircraft behaving oddly, keeping their distance instead of pressing home attacks, as if they were waiting for something or trialing tactics the Kriegsmarine had yet to meet. The Mosquito's story was extraordinary, envisioned as an unarmed, high-speed bomber that would depend on velocity and altitude rather than defensive guns. It was built mostly from wood at a time when most powers were moving to metal airframes. That unconventional choice produced one of the war's most adaptable machines able to act as a fighter bomber, reconnaissance platform, and, later, a flying anti-tank weapon. Its twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines pushing it past Ampatradas. MPH Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the founder's son and chief test pilot, played a key role in proving the type's strengths, showing that wooden construction could tolerate battle damage differently than metal aircraft and that the smooth plywood skin reduced drag compared with riveted aluminium, helping the Mosquito's outstanding performance. He could hardly have imagined it would one day carry a weapon designed to kill tanks. As the sun burned through breaks in the cloud and silvered patches of SIA situation that normally favored defenders by attacker squadron, Leader Phillips had his forced approach from the east, so the glare stayed behind them. From 5,000 feet they eased back on the throttles to make a steady run while the navigator prepared the sights on the lead barrier ship. The convoy's layout reflected hard-won Bay of Biscay experience. Minesweepers, spaced to provide overlapping coverage but far enough apart to avoid multiple losses to a single explosion. Concrete-clad barrier vessels leading to take mine blasts and repel head-on strikes, while U-960 lay central, ready to crash dive if the escort screen failed. Though Steinberg knew diving in shallow coastal waters risked betraying his position to hunting destroyers. Flight Officer Turner, flying the second Molins, Mosquito MM425, watched Phillips begin the run and saw the string of tracers rise as every capable gun opened up. 20mm rounds self-destructed in puffs around 2,000 meters, while 37mm tracers burned out nearer 3,000 meters, though the shells themselves continued beyond the visible tracers and could still be lethal to any aircraft unlucky enough to cross their paths. Trials had shown the Molins 57mm to be surprisingly accurate, Once crews learned to offset the slight nose-down trim from recoil, they could hit tank-sized silhouettes at roughly 1,500 yards. The heavy hydraulic buffer soaked most of the kick, but still affected trim enough that pilots had to hold steady on the controls during firing to keep their aim true. In Berlin, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz studied fresh loss reports with growing unease. U-boat casualties had not fallen despite convoy procedures and beefed up. AAN suspected the British had introduced tactics or weapons that nullified German defenses, even as his staff insisted that concentrated fire from multiple escorts should make close attacks too costly. Reports from the Mediterranean told a similar story. Admiral Raphael Dorton informed Supermarina that British aircraft were damaging ships without closing two customary attack ranges, especially at night, a phenomenon he blamed on better torpedoes rather than on standoff gunnery, a misreading that would cost the Regia Marina several vessels before Italy's surrender. Japanese doctrine favored rapid crash dives within 30 seconds to avoid air attack, but the long Bay of Biscay transit to German yards made that impractical and forced reliance on German escorts whose effectiveness Japanese commanders privately doubted as losses mounted despite ever heavier AA fits. Then Phillips aircraft fired. The first 57mm shell from his Molins-equipped Mosquito struck the lead barrier. Shipped just above the WATER-LINE. An armor-piercing round tore through the converted merchant's plating and detonated inside an ammunition magazine, driving smoke and flames through the ventilation trunks as secondary explosions ripped through the ship. German crews kept firing while damage control parties scrambled to contain the inferno. Training overriding the instinct to take cover, Steinberg watched, incredulous, as the British aircraft continued their run from well beyond the escort's effective flak zone, firing calm, precise shots that struck home with the deep crack of large-calibre ordnance, a sound unlike the dull thuds of bombs or depth charges. He had known the new weapon changed the fight. The Molins 57 could be employed accurately at roughly 1,800 yards, while German 20mm flak fell ineffective past about 2,000 meters, creating a lethal band in which the Mosquitoes could operate with near impunity. Their wooden construction made optical ranging difficult, and their high speed complicated deflection calculations, factors that together handed the attackers a decisive edge. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, on 1M class minesweeper, ordered his 37mm crew to fire despite the range, hoping the heavier shells might force the Mosquitoes off. But the British pilots clearly understood the limits of return fire and kept their distance while methodically pouring rounds into the convoy at a measured rate that suggested conservation. Rather than indiscriminate spraying, the second Molins pass targeted U-960 itself. Flight Officer Turner brought his sights to the conning tower, and his first shell struck the bridge, spraying fragments into nearby gun crews. Steinberg felt the shock through his feet as the 57mm punched through the outer casing, ruptured fuel tanks and sent diesel streaming into the boat's wake. The escorts tried to lay smoke, but the Mosquito's altitude let them pick sight lines through gaps and correct aim from last observed positions. Shells kept finding targets, knocking out gun positions and detonating magazines, each hit eroding the convoy's defensive ability. Phillips then made another run on a minesweeper that had moved to shield U-9, his remaining rounds smashing the bridge and engine room and slowing the vessel, so it fell out of formation. As smoke belched from vents and the crew abandoned guns to fight fires, openings that conventional Mosquito fighter bombers immediately exploited, the psychological effect was profound. Gun crews realized their weapons could not reach the attackers, producing a helplessness that corroded morale more than ordinary bombing had, and forcing a wholesale rethink of convoy defense that had seemed adequate months earlier. When U-960 limped into La Pallas with 3 escorts damaged and hundreds of casualties, Steinberg's after-action report warned that aircraft able to fire from beyond effective flak range made defense nearly impossible, and recommended continuous fighter escort for future passages. Rather than sole reliance on anti-aircraft batteries, Marine Technical Intelligence at first refused to believe a 57mm had been mounted in an aircraft. Experts insisting recoil would destroy any wooden airframe, but recovered shell fragments and multiple eyewitness statements forced acceptance and urgent demands for longer-ranged AA weapons to engage Mosquitoes before they reached firing positions. Wing Commander Tony Phillips continued flying the Molins-armed Mosquito through spring 1944, including the May attack on I-29, in which 4 rounds destroyed a Ru-88. One shot even tore the enemy's engine completely off, a dramatic demonstration of the 57mm's power against aircraft as well as ships, though that effect was incidental to the gun's main role. The Molins firm was recognized for its contribution, and Desmond Molins received the U.S. Medal of Freedom for adapting cigarette machinery techniques to weapons manufacture. The company returned to civilian production after the war, and its brief weapons work remained a closely held secret. Germany rushed new AA projects, guided weapons, and proximity-fused shells among them. But these programs arrived too late to alter the Battle of the Atlantic. and U-boat losses climbed through 1944 as Allied air power exploited its technological advantages. Italian officers reading German reports worried that their own 20mm Breda mounts were even less able to counter standoff attacks and tried to obtain 37mm and 40mm guns before Italy's surrender halted those efforts. While the Japanese submarine arm incorporated lessons from the I-29 encounter by adding more anti-aircraft weapons and training crews to engage aircraft at maximum range, regardless of ammunition expenditure, although additional precautions were tried. They proved futile when I-52 was located and sunk by conventional Allied aircraft in June 1944. Despite its reinforced defenses, production of the Mosquito Tetsi continued through 1944. With roughly 27 examples completed before the program, it was halted in favor of rocket-armed fighter bombers that offered broader mission flexibility even if they were less precise. This shift reflected the waning U-boat threat and the desire for aircraft that could strike varied targets without major modification. Though veterans of 248th Squadron insisted nothing matched the Tetsi's ability to smash hardened objectives from safe standoff ranges. Beyond its combat effectiveness, the mere existence of the Tetsi had a powerful psychological effect. U-boat crews became increasingly hesitant to surface, even in well-escorted convoys, knowing British aircraft could punch through pressure holes from distances beyond effective return fire. A fear that contributed to the practical abandonment of U-boat operations in the Bay of Biscay by late 1944. Technical study of the Molins-armed revealed clever fixes to problems that had baffled conventional designers. The feeding mechanism borrowed concepts from high-speed packaging, machinery to deliver heavy 57mm rounds reliably during violent maneuvers, and the 5-tray magazine arrangement reduced interruptions for reloads that had plagued other large aircraft guns. German responses were improvised and often desperate. Army 88mm guns were mounted on specially strengthened ships, mainly to give crews something to aim at despite the slow traverse limiting their effectiveness against fast aircraft. Their value, therefore, more psychological than practical. British tactics combined Molins-armed Mosquitoes with standard fighter bomber Mosquitoes, so the 57mm birds suppressed AA positions from long range, while conventional types closed to finish off targets with rockets and cannon, a combined arms method that proved devastating even against heavily escorted convoys. Supporting the Tetsi effort required a specialized industrial and maintenance network at Coastal Command. Bases where technicians skilled in both airframe systems and artillery upkeep kept the complex autoloaders serviceable, a hybrid expertise that had no wartime precedent. German countermeasure R&D explored radar-directed flak and proximity-fused projectiles. But the Mosquito's wooden skin returned poorly to radar, and its speed complicated fire control solutions, rendering existing German systems largely ineffective. The operational impact went beyond ships sunk. Submarines were forced to spend long stretches submerged to avoid air attack, lengthening transits and reducing effectiveness, while destroyers and minesweepers tied up as escorts were denied to other tasks, producing cascading strains across naval resources. Post-war analysis by U.S. naval researchers judged the Mosquito Tetsi an elegant, cost-effective answer to a narrow tactical problem permitting standoff engagement of hardened maritime targets without the expense and complexity of guided munitions. The Americans ultimately favored rockets and torpedoes. For their greater adaptability, the human toll was severe. Hundreds of German sailors were killed or wounded by 57mm strikes that pierced plating, and survivors recounted lasting psychological trauma from being under fire by weapons they could not reach, damage to morale that lingered even after ships reached defended ports. Squadron logs show Tetsi pilots needed extensive training to manage the altered handling of their modified Mosquitoes. The off-center gun installation created asymmetric thrust and the recoil altered trim, complicating engine-out procedures and demanding constant control inputs. During firing sequences, skills that typically took weeks to master. Allied planners considered the concept for the Pacific, but Japan's surrender precluded large-scale deployment, leaving the Mosquito Tetsi as a theater-specific innovation whose full promise remained unfulfilled. Maintenance proved another constraint. 57mm barrels wore quickly under high-velocity fire and required replacement after roughly 200 rounds, forcing careful ammunition management and encouraging pilots to reserve their 25-round loadouts for high-value targets. Captured German documents underscored the intelligence value of Tetsi operations, revealing deep anxieties among U-boat commanders and providing material that Allied propaganda exploited to further sap enemy confidence. Whether in the Bay of Biscay, fog storms and rough seas, so limited sorties and complicated aiming, training pilots to compensate for ship motion when engaging moving ships, a demanding skill set honed only in combat. The Tetsi left a legacy in post-war armament thinking, Several nations briefly explored large calibre aircraft guns for anti-shipping tasks, but the rise of guided missiles rendered flying artillery largely obsolete except in niche ground attack roles. German naval engineers who examined the effects of 57 mm impacts on submarine hulls concluded extant U-boats were vulnerable at ranges beyond 2,000 meters when struck at favorable angles, prompting recommendations for heavier protection that were never practical given weight limits and the war's end. Finally, the coordination between Coastal Command and Intelligence Ultra-decrypts, providing precise routing while reconnaissance confirmed convoy locations proved a model of inter-service cooperation, and Tetsi crew training emphasized deflection, firing and range estimation, with pilots logging hours on towed targets to develop the instinctive lead needed for accurate long-range aerial gunnery, techniques more akin to naval surface fire control than conventional air-to-ground shooting. The Mosquito Tetsi's last sortie took place on 5 April 1945 in the Kattegat, when mosquitoes attacked a German surface group and sank 5 ships, including a concrete-clad barrier vessel with all hands lost, proving that even in the closing weeks of the war, German defenses could not reliably defeat the system. 57 mm rounds continued to find vulnerable points despite intense return fire. Records of ammunition use indicate about 1 confirmed hit for every 3 rounds fired at naval targets, an extraordinary hit ratio that vindicated the concept, even though only some examples were completed before the program was wound down in favor of rocket-armed fighter bombers that offered broader flexibility. Human factors engineering had been incorporated into the conversions. Pilots wore reinforced shoulder restraints to absorb the abrupt deceleration from each shot, and navigators received extra padding to protect them during the violent pitching that accompanied official German propaganda played down the Tetsi's effectiveness, but internal Kriegsmarine traffic made clear the alarm at senior levels, with admirals privately conceding that no existing doctrinal or technological fix could counter the threat. Manufacturing the Tetsi required close cooperation between de Havilland's aircraft works and the Molins machinery plant, with sub-assemblies produced at different sites and final integration carried out in specially arranged facilities where technicians could precisely align gun and airframe. Tactically, the Germans tried expedients such as building lightly armored decoy merchants, bristling with AA to draw fire away from valuable U-boat. But British intelligence rapidly identified those ships and instructed Mosquito crews to ignore decoys in favor of verified submarine contacts. Whether imposed hard limits on Tetsi employment, accurate long-range gunnery demanded good visibility and clear sight, restricting missions to daylight hours with acceptable meteorological conditions, and the Bay of Biscay's notorious fog and storms often curtailed operations. Post-war interviews with Kriegs personnel showed the psychological legacy of the Tetsi outlived its limited numbers. Crews who had never directly encountered the weapon still feared it, based on survivor testimony, creating a reputation that sometimes exceeded the scale of actual operations. Economic appraisal within the Air Ministry concluded that, despite the costs of conversion and specialist training, the Tetsi program was highly cost-effective when measured by damage inflicted on high-value targets and the relatively low loss rate of the aircraft involved, a judgment that supported the doctrine even as rockets became the preferred option. Molins archive technical files record, exhaustive ground trials, thousands of rounds fired to destruction. During endurance testing, before the autoloader was certified for airborne use, each subcomponent tested to ensure reliability under the stresses of combat. The program's influence reached into other design studies, with several post-war proposals examining large-calibre aircraft guns for anti-shipping roles, although only the Mosquito combined the speed, range and structure necessary to carry such a system successfully. German intelligence sought technical details by attempting to recruit Molins employees and offering rewards for but British counterintelligence largely prevented any major leak. Tactically, the Tetsi doctrine stressed patience and measured engagement. Pilots were trained to hold the optimum standoff range and accept prolonged exposure rather than close in and maneuver violently, trusting speed and separation to provide safety. Operational analysis showed the highest effectiveness when Mosquitoes flew paired missions, one suppressing AA positions from distance while the other engaged the primary target. This pairing maximized the limited 25-round load while reducing vulnerable exposure. Program was discontinued early in 1945 as the U menace waned and operational priorities shifted toward aircraft capable of supporting land operations. Rockets offered a more versatile, easier-to-fit armament for surviving maritime targets. Yet historical assessment credits the Mosquito Tetsi with playing a pivotal role in sustaining pressure on German submarine operations during 1944, helping prevent the Kriegsmarine from regaining the initiative despite new U-boat designs. Preserving Tetsi aircraft after the war proved difficult because of the program's secrecy. Most examples were scrapped or reverted to standard Mosquito configuration. leaving photographs, drawings, and veterans' testimony as the principal records. Former 248 squadron members kept the story alive in informal reunions, and the full account emerged only as classifications lapsed and official histories were published. More broadly, the Tsetse episode demonstrated that conventional ordnance, intelligently adapted and supported by industrial automation and inter-service coordination, could solve particular tactical problems without entirely new airframes, a lesson that influenced post-war procurement thinking, which often favored modifying existing platforms rather than commissioning single-purpose designs. Contemporary analysts note the Tsetse's relevance to the enduring requirement for standoff engagement in anti-ship warfare, though modern practice relies on guided missiles rather than large direct-fire guns. In sum, the Mosquito Tetsi was a short-lived but consequential innovation. By integrating aircraft design, artillery mechanisms, and automated feeding systems, it delivered a precision standoff strike capability that forced a fundamental rethink of convoy and submarine defense, exposed U-boats and escorts to attacks beyond the reach of their guns, and contributed materially to the collapse of the U-boat threat and the Allied victory in the Battle